My SHA experience was MMI 20 years ago, God forbid. And it was a 4-week residential program. And it was transformative. So some of my most trusted friends are still those people, some of those people. And you never, at least in my experience, get to leave the real world, or almost leave the real world and have a chance to sit and think and learn from your colleagues. So, apropos of that, I left at your spots 2 index cards. So we're going to take 2 minutes here. And I want you to fill out these 2 index cards. And the first one is just for you. And on this, you're going to write the super secret reason, the super secret outcome you want to have from this 3 weeks. This is not what you put down when you asked your boss or your board or time to go. This is not what you put down in the materials in applying. This is your super secret thing. And you're going to put this in your pocket. And no one but you is going to see it. So, I want you to fill out number 1 card. Number 2 card, and then I'll give you a couple minutes. I think that a major motivator for all of us in this business was an early light bulb, an early experience. So I want to know, I want you to write down why you are, what was that experience and when did it happen, briefly. And then we're going to talk about 2 or 3 or 4 of those. So those will be public. So use your good handwriting and don't be too long. So a couple minutes to do these things. Pass the public cards down here to either end so I can pick them up, shuffle them, and oh, no. Well, unless, you're perfectly, I don't mind if you claim them, but you don't have to. Put that private one in your purse or your pocket, your notebook. I still have the list I made when I went to the Stowe Center. Some smart colleague at Colorado Historical said, write it down. And it's really great to look at. So, great. Thank you very much. All right? We'll just shuffle these, right? Can I do this? I think these are shuffleable. You think I'm pushing it? Oh, a challenge is over. Yeah, it's harder than I thought. My mother could do this thing with cards like this. Can anybody do that? No? So,
I'll do it. I'll do it.
You can do it, Bob?
I can't do it fancy or anything, but I'll do it so that you
Shuffle.
Yes. You got them all?
But I believe that's what we're getting. Shuffle and then, pick 2 or 3. So here's my story. I was 9 years old and we were on a family holiday. We were in the Orkney Islands. Anybody know where that is? North of Scotland. North of Scotland. We were living in Scotland at the time. So 9 years old. God only knows why my parents did this, but off we trekked for a summer holiday in the Orkney Islands. This is a place where on a warm day you're wearing your fleece. But it was a transformative holiday for everybody, thank you. It's a memory the family still talks about, and for me, it was it turns out, it sort of set the rest of my life, the path of my life. We got up one morning and the kids said, what are we going to do this day? And the parents said, we are going to Skara Brae. And in my head, I can still visualize what I thought. Oh, another historic house. Another old house, because we're in Britain. We went to a lot of old houses. Another place full of arms and armor, which my 3 younger brothers loved and I'd had enough of. But that's not what it was. Skara Brae is a Neolithic site from 5,000 years ago of ancient peoples who lived on right next to the ocean, near the ocean, in these still cold islands in the North Sea. And they lived sort of semi-subterranean. each dwelling, it's a little bit like pit houses in the Southwest, each dwelling about 40 square meters, semi-subterranean, and they raised a little barley, and they fished, and they survived. But it was an amazingly beautiful place, and it made me wonder, how did they live? What did they do? What did they think? What were their lives like in this amazing place? I wanted to know. So here I am. There's a direct line from that to the Harriett Beecher Stowe Center. It's the same thing, and we all do it. What did they do? What did they think? How did they do it? And so what? What does it mean for us? So that's my line. It wasn't quite straight, but that's my line. So I'm going to just pick a couple here and pass them to a couple of you and ask you to read them aloud. And if I gave you yours, did I give you yours? No? All right. Good. Julia.
Right. There's three essentially on here. There's actually 3.A. One, seeing the ruby slippers, history can be cool. 1A, Gettysburg, the power of history's presence. 2, processing collections at the Mathers. Someone's job is to handle really cool old stuff. And 3, bartending near a political meeting where history was being distorted to further an agenda. I was motivated to use history to counter.
Ah, the truth. Amanda.
Our first grade field trip was to the big city of Pittsburgh to visit the Carnegie Museums. It wasn't the dinosaurs that I loved, but the smaller people-oriented exhibits, cultural related.
I was awaiting deployment as a Peace Corps volunteer and was offered an internship through the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation. I had the opportunity to help with the analysis and management of a new park and realized that there was an alternative to academia. I had not heard much about public history.
Fascinating. 3 different experiences, 3 different opportunities, and I can't wait to read the rest of them. And I think, I ask you to think about this, because it's a major part of our motivation. When we get up in the morning, the reasons we got into it in the first place. And being mindful of that as you go through the next 3 weeks, and then you go through the rest of your career, can be really useful when you run up against the barriers. Because this 3 weeks is about you as individuals and the relationships you're going to build with one another. The learning is exciting, but you're going to have time to think and muse and wonder, and you're going to go back with new ideas, and you're going to want to try them out. And you're going to run into barriers, so then it's time to think about why I do this in the first place. Why did I get up this morning? So I decided at Scarborough, and once I figured it out, that what I wanted to be was an archaeologist. And in the United States, that means there's an anthropologist. There are other anthropologists in this room. Raise your hands. Yes. Yes. So, anthropologists can do anything.
Study humans.
History is a subset of anthropology. That's a discussion we can have over beer later. So ultimately, I went to graduate school in anthropology, did some archaeological field work in the southwestern United States. It was so long ago that there was only AM, not FM radio. And it was 20 miles from any running water and all that means. And that was transformative too. Wonderful experiences. But then I figured out that if you're going to have any kind of personal life in southwestern archaeology, you better work in museums. So I worked at the Denver Art Museum on a special cataloging project. And then I went to the Colorado Historical Society for 16 years. And I'm telling you this to get a sense of the kinds of museums and the kinds of checkered background I have. Because museums are my third career. First career was waitress. And that's how I learned about customer service. And how what goes in our pockets has to do, generally, with the relationship you can build with people. Second career was sociology, social research. I was trying to be relevant. I decided that anthropology was more relevant. And then museums. So Colorado Historical Society for 16 years. And then I got a call one day, would you come and talk to us about the Harriett Beecher Stowe Center? And I'm like, Harriett Beecher Stowe, Hartford, Connecticut. I knew who the Beechers were because they're everywhere. Lyman Beecher, some of you are nodding. Lyman Beecher, patriarch of Stowe's generation, where there were 11 children, was described as being the father of more brains than any man in America. Harriett Beecher Stowe, of course, wrote 30 books, but she's best known for Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's really an amazing story. So she is in church. Imagine this. It's 1850. It's the height of the national conversation about slavery. She has just moved from 20 years in Cincinnati to Brunswick, Maine. Her husband got a new job at Bowdoin, and they were just there a couple years before they went to Massachusetts. She was a Connecticut native, born in 1811. 10 siblings, as I mentioned, and her father had a reputation. So her name, Beecher, was a known name. And she was already a well-known writer. She'd written one book, a geography for children, and many articles for the women's writing industry. So she was known. So she's in church one Sunday morning. A very regular experience for her, daughter of a minister. And she said later that she saw a vision in church. Now, this is not a woman who usually saw visions. Her husband did, but she didn't. So she saw a vision. What she saw was what became the end of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Tom is beaten to death by Simon Legree because Tom won't give up two women who have escaped from Simon Legree's plantation. So she has this vision, sees this story, knows the end of the story, and goes home and writes it up, and then reads it in the parlor to her family, which is how she always audience tested her work. There's a reason this stuff is called parlor literature. And they said, oh, you've got to turn that into more. It got a reaction from them all. And she was really motivated to do this for a couple of reasons. The Beechers were in an uproar about the Fugitive Slave Act. And I think this is probably an audience I don't have to explain that to. But it made every American complicit in slavery. You all were complicit because you all were responsible for returning fugitives to their owners, simplifying it greatly. So the Beechers were in a tizzy about this, and Stowe had been writing back and forth, friends and relatives, and thanks to letters, of course, we know something about this. So she also had just had a devastating personal experience. The summer of 1849 in Cincinnati, there was a cholera epidemic. And there was a cholera epidemic every summer in Cincinnati, but this one struck one of her children. At the time, she had 6 children. It struck Charlie, the toddler, 18 months old. And we know what this experience is like because her husband, Calvin, professor of theology, was away. And so they were writing to each other. So she wrote letters every day about little Charlie's status and how it was going. Cholera is a terrible death. It's a horrible death. And Stowe said later that it was at Charlie's bedside that she first understood what it might be for an enslaved woman to have her children sold away, building the empathy that she used all through Uncle Tom's Cabin. And of course, Charlie died. A devastating experience. And one that many 19th century families had more than once. But the Stowes hadn't had this experience. So all of that, the political anger and the power of grief, went into what became Uncle Tom's Cabin, based on that vision in church in 1850. You go to that church today in Brunswick, Maine, and it's pew 23, and there's a plaque. So Stowe wrote off to Gamaliel Bailey at the National Era in Washington, D.C., one of the best 19th century names ever, Gamaliel Bailey, and said, I'm going to write you 3 or 4 pieces on this thing called slavery. And she started writing, and it turned into 45 pieces. It came out week after week after week. So this book that changed American attitudes came out as a serial publication. She didn't sit out and graph it all out ahead of time. It it took on a life of its own. And she used all of her experiences from on the slave line in Cincinnati with Kentucky right across the way. Her brother's experiences traveling in Louisiana brought back some of the stories that she used. The readings of freedom narratives she used and fictionalized, and it all went into this book that became an international bestseller. It also became, of course, a racial slur, the title character, which is part of the story. And at the Stowe Center, it's part of the story that we don't want to ignore. And that's part of my message today. You got to look at the hard stuff in the face, and you have to figure out ways to convey the hard stuff to the public and converse about it with the public and build your own capacity to do that and not ignore the hard stuff. Whether it's the grief of the death of children and subsequent grief, which you know will get a reaction from your public, but also the issues around Uncle Tom and why that term is a racial slur and what it means for us today, stereotyping. So many things. It became, we believe, a racial slur partly because Uncle Tom's Cabin was so popular it went right onto the stage immediately. So when Stowe traveled to Great Britain in 1853, where there were sold 1.5 million copies of this book in the first year it was out. She landed at Liverpool in April 1853, invited by anti-slavery groups. There were, in London, there were 10 versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin running on stage. 10. It was so big, there was all this popular culture around it. Soap, scarves, handkerchiefs, spoons, wallpaper. We just acquired some wallpaper. 1853 wallpaper with scenes of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Unbelievably huge. And then as a play, it ran on stage for 90 years. It's the most performed play in American history, still arguably. And itinerant troops that traveled the country. So all of this is in this content when they called me up and asked me would I come to the Harriett Beecher Stowe Center. So there I am. And I think another point I'd like you to take away is the reason I made the decision for this, to go to this place and leave beautiful Colorado, because everybody says, you moved here from Colorado, is because what I'm good at and what they needed were a good match. And because the people in Connecticut appreciate history. They aren't quite aware that they appreciate it, but they do. It's deeply part of Connecticut culture. Mark's laughing. Deeply part of New England culture. And I went there because I also wanted to go to a place, some of my mentors said, why are you going to such a little place? Well, at little places, you can make change a lot faster than at big places. And Stowe's story, it seemed to me this was amazing. Stowe's story is local history. She's a Connecticut native. It's Hartford history. It's Litchfield history. But it's international history. So when I did a keynote at the Danish Museums Association, I could say, how many of you have read Uncle Tom's Cabin? And 300 people went like this. How many of you have read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Well, that's pretty good. In a regular audience, it's like 2 people. And what we also find is people think they've read it, but they haven't. So they read, as my first exposure was classic comics. Right? So, I also went there because the board was ready for change, and they had thought about some of this stuff. John was asking me earlier, when did they change the name to the Harriett Beecher Stowe Center? They changed it in 1994, but they didn't tell anybody. So it was still known as the Stowe Day Foundation, which was short for the Stowe Beecher Hooker Memorial Library and Foundation. So Harriett Beecher Stowe Center is much better. But they changed the name because they didn't want to be just a historic house museum. So the site is 2.5 acres in Hartford, Connecticut. Right next door is the Mark Twain House on a shared campus, a separate nonprofit. Stowe is one of the main reasons he moved there. Famous international author, a generation older than him. He was starting his career. 2.5 acres, we have 3 historic buildings. Stowe's house, which is a modest 2.5-story, some of you've probably been there, pattern book style house from 1871, and right next door a Gilded Age mansion that we call the Katherine Day House after the woman who founded the Stowe Center. And then a carriage house that we use as a visitor center. So when I went there, I was recruited because everybody wanted change. Now the staff didn't want change, most of them. So that's hard. But we all started working together because part of what everybody, as you know, what you need to do as a leader, whatever your level, is get everybody lined up going the same direction and agreeing what direction you're going. It seems so simple. You can't say it enough times. It's so important. So that's another message for you. So we did some strategic planning and that sort of stuff, but we really knew we wanted to change perceptions and change audience and grow the audience. So what did we know about the audience? Well, at the Stowe Center, we knew that the audience was, and still is largely, the house tour audience is white women of a certain age, as they say in France, well-educated and relatively prosperous, right? That's the demographic for historic house museums all across the country. We knew that if people who came to the Stowe Center and heard the story would empathize with Stowe. They could relate their stories to hers. We knew, of course, that Uncle Tom's Cabin is a barrier. And at the time, we weren't really taking it head on. We weren't really talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, because that's why she's known. Not all her 30 other books. It's Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're talking too much about the other books. And we also think that Uncle Tom's Cabin is a responsibility, because it is complicated American history. And I think that's an important thing that we all do. The complicated elements of American history, not the simplified elements of American history. And more people want the depth of it, is my sense. I don't have research on this, rather than the superficial stuff. So, what do we know about historic house museum visitors in general, right? We know that they are women of a certain age, blah, blah, blah. What else do we know? Any thoughts on that about historic house museum visitors?
They're growing extinct.
They're growing. And you say that because the numbers of attendees are going down? Or because they're all 50 plus?
Maybe it's the lack of recruitment, yes, in rising generations perhaps, yeah.
Very good point. Yep. Any other thoughts about?
Often you only visit once. I've seen this house, nothing's going to change, I'm done.
Good point. So we changed that with programs, and we changed it with, we changed the tours every month or 6 weeks on an annual cycle, so there's always something different. But yes, that's a very good point. So you have to, so what we're doing here is, like a good salesperson, identifying the objections and dealing with them. Any other comments about Historic House Museum?
There's often an interest in objects, a kind of connoisseurship, which in some ways relates to the demographics.
Yes. Yes. True.
Rather than the stories that contextualize.
Right. Good point. I also think that, and stuff that we know from experience and from research, people come to history through their own personal experiences and often their family history. So the more you can do in the experience to connect them with their own personal lives and personal history or empathy and emotions, the more successful you're going to be in getting people to show up. And I think that there's some interesting stuff going on in the Academy around memory. Some of us may have seen or read Edward Linenthal, of course, David Dwight's classic book, Race and Reunion, etc. But there's a whole field of history now in the Academy on memory. And I think that we ignore that at our peril. You can look around and see some of the organizations that are based on individual personal memories, like the Japanese American National Museum, or the United States Holocaust Museum. All those are coming out of experiences, individual experiences around large events that we are all culturally trying to deal with. Historic house museums, like museums in general, are really deeply conservative. You can argue that they're the most change averse of all museums, perhaps. And this is stuff I thought before I went there. I also think they're boring. Because you're stuck with the tour guide. It's totally usually the tour guide, and you're dependent on the tour guide. And so everyone's struggling with the model, and you're going to have discussions later in the program about that. So I'm not going to go off on that tangent. We also know from current research that people who go to historic house museums want meaning. That's what Spencer's going to talk about in the morning. They want choice. They don't want to go just, we don't want them to go just once. We need to give them choice. And they want choice in their experiences. They don't necessarily want to do a guided tour. They want to do a tour on their own. Or maybe they just want to go in one room. Or maybe they want to just look at one artifact. They want to see themselves in the experience. And that takes us to some discussions about audience fragmentation in a minute. I also think that we all, and I see this among my colleagues, we assume too much. We assume they know too much. We assume they care as much as we do, and you know they probably don't care as much as we do. You just wrote that down in these cards. So people come to the Stowe Center may not know quite when that Civil War was, or maybe even quite what it was about. They probably don't remember that women couldn't vote in Stowe's era. So we can't assume that sort of stuff. And we're so deep into it that we forget to take a step back and look at what people know or don't know as they come in these places. So I think for all of us, a major issue is what in the newspapers you see as discussions around fragmentation. And I think of it as audience fragmentation. So it used to be that we all watched sort of the same TV shows, right? There were 4 channels and nothing on. And now there are thousands of channels. So that our shared culture is more fragmented. That's not a bad thing or a good thing, it just is. So you can make a joke about popular culture and not everyone will get it anymore. Because not everyone saw that show or that movie. And on the ground, we have at least in our museums 4 generations, from millennials to baby boomers, or even there's still some best generation people left surviving, right? 4 to 5 generations. And what the millennials are interested in, you read about this, you all are reading this stuff. And what the baby boomers are interested in is different. So you're sort of doing 4 sets of kinds of programs. Or you're doing your programs so that it works for the interests of all of these groups. Millennials have short attention spans, they want novelty, they want different things than baby boomers or the folks in between. But what everybody wants now is experiences. It isn't anymore about the stuff. And we have to, much as we love the stuff, we have to admit that. It's about the experience with the stuff. And the more we think of it as an experience, the more successful we're going to be. Another element of audience fragmentation is that by 2040 we will be, I always have to write this down so I get it the right way, minority majority. And there, I think some of the issues on the front page we see right now are because of this transition. This is going to be an American lurch because white folks are used to being in charge and in control, and that's not the case anymore. It's changing. And when you look around this room, you can see that we have some work to do on that. I only see 3 or 4 people with curly hair. So we need a more diverse representation at all the tables. In our profession, as the professionals, curly hair is my way of talking about diversity. Sometimes that joke works, sometimes it doesn't. The curly hair club. Some of you were in it, but you're hiding it.
Is it
Some
that
of you
obvious?
Some of you are faking it. But if we, I think this is a huge responsibility. We've been talking about it for 30 years. But I don't think we're really putting the effort into it, and that it's irresponsible not to. I'm talking about the people who are at the professional tables. I'm also talking about the people who are coming in the doors. The people who, so generally the people who go to museums are white people, and and they come from families where people went to museums. That is less the tradition in populations of color. What does that mean for all of us? It means a lot. So think about what kind of organizations we would be if we did that differently. We'd be very different. Audience fragmentation, we talked about boomers to millennials, but senior citizens, of course, a key part of our demographic at all museums. There are going to be more of them than ever because boomers are never going to die. What does that mean for your physical plant? What does that mean for your interpretive strategies? What does that mean for the programs you program and how you do it? It means a lot. In Hartford, one of the reasons I was interested in moving to the Stowe Center is because Hartford, Connecticut is one of the poorest cities in the country. There are 3 or 4 of them in Connecticut. One of the poorest cities in the country, and with one of the biggest educational gaps in the country. And Connecticut is one of the richest states in the country. Connecticut and New Jersey are going back and forth for that award periodically. Now that kind of ironic juxtaposition is something that's really interesting, right? It tells you a lot about Connecticut. And you can draw some conclusions from that. And the Stowe Center is right in the middle of this because we are in Hartford. You can't up and move historic sites the way you can corporate headquarters. What does that mean for organizations in those positions and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it? So we took that, all of these observations about demographics and audience, and I actually don't really believe audience is the right word. I don't really know what the new word is, what the right word is, but it all has to do with who are the people that we are trying to partner with to implement our missions. So I don't think partner is the right word either. Sometimes you charge your partners to come in the door or pay to play, but you don't always, So I think thinking about what the right words are is important. Stowe Center, we looked at our responsibilities and made a few conclusions. So we have Uncle Tom and the challenges of Uncle Tom. Harriett Beecher Stowe, who is less known than she might be given her impact. One of my mantras is, there's never enough time or money. Because there isn't, even at the Indiana Historical Society. There's never enough time or money. That means you've got to focus. You have to decide, again, you all know this, but it's a reminder. You have to focus. You always have to focus. You have to prioritize. And you have to work together to do that sort of stuff. I also think that it's a responsibility to find our niches. Our personal niches in our careers and our institutions' niches. So Hal was talking about that as she was talking about the relationship with the state Indiana organization, the Indiana State Museum, right? At the Stowe Center, the first thing we need to look at is the Mark Twain House right next door. But we also need to look at the overcrowded historic house museum market. Because I always argue, I forgot this part from the audience, this is one of my favorite things. People go to historic house museums because they're voyeurs. That's why they go. That's really why they go. They're nosy. They want to see how those people live. And if there's a little celebrity involved in our celebrity culture, even better. They're nosy. So how are we going to take that and turn it into mission? And as the Stowe Centers, we did our planning and work. We looked at our responsibilities, including the public trust. I think this is a big umbrella, and another key point here in what I'm trying to say today. The public trust is something we all live in. It's a legal framework that exempts us from some of the taxes that a corporation has to pay or other corporate structures have to pay, but not all of them. It exempts us, usually, though under threat, from property tax and income tax of different kinds. And so it is a gift from state, local, and federal governments to all of us in which we operate. A gift that we really need to treat with respect. And think about that word trust and what it means. Because luckily, museums are still among the most trusted organizations. And according to the research from Rosenzweig and Thielen, whose names I can never pronounce, to much more contemporary work around the same topic, people still trust history organizations. In a world where they don't trust anybody, civic engagement is down the tubes. People don't vote, they don't join up with civic-related organizations, they don't participate in the ways they used to. And that is interpreted as a lack of civic engagement and as an American issue. You can argue that either way. But that public trust means the public trusts us. And we have to be trustworthy. So we live in it, and we live on it. At the Stowe Center, it means that when they come into our period rooms, they think that that's exactly how it was when Stowe did live there. That's what people believe. That's how much they trust these places. That's a big responsibility. So I think it means we need to tell the whole truth, all of it, and complicated American history again. And we need to let them know that how we know and what we know about what it looked like when Stowe was there, or what we don't know, so it's not misleading. And as part of telling the whole truth, I think we should be looking at language. Needless to say, at the Harriett Beecher Stowe Center, we're going to be thinking about language. Uncle Tom is a racial slur, and we're talking about complicated American history. So how we talk about the people who lived in slavery is really important. We train staff in that. I think slave is a word kind of like slut. It's carries a lot of weight. But those were individuals and people with individual lives, and how we talk about them is really important. So that's a bit of an obsession. But you're going to have your own language issues at your own sites, whatever it might be. So at the Stowe Center, what we did is we decided we were a safe place to talk about hard stuff. And we talk about that in our programs. A safe place to talk about hard stuff. And that means they have to trust us, and we have to trust them, the participants in the conversation, to be civil and civic. Some programs will even sort of lay these out as ground rules, without making a big fuss about it. And it works. And when you look at public frustration with our legislative leaders, you know how much people care about civil and civic conversation. They might not be joining the Rotary Club anymore in official civic engagement, but we all, and our publics really care. So at sites like the Stowe Center, we try and take advantage of that. We build programs using dialogue, programs using conversation, and programs around solving problems. Because Stowe wrote about so much stuff, we have a really big window in which we can operate. But generally, we're talking about race, gender, and class issues. So last week, we did one of our regular series, Salons at Stowe. Let's see, last week. Is this still this week or last week? Anyway, Thursday, we did Salons at Stowe. We do every couple weeks. Actually, I have info for you. And we did it about teaching empathy. Because it turns out, we learned from another salon, with a famous, though extremely arrogant psychiatrist, that you can teach empathy. And so we had a salon around that and a public discussion. And we set these programs up in circles kind of like this. We have a couple featured guests who are experts. They start the conversation, but they only start it. And then it's I facilitate usually, so it can't totally go wild. We capture all the ideas, we blog about them, tweet about them, and post them, and encourage people to take their own action. Our mission is to inspire positive change. But you have to make the change. We'll give you the tools. So it's been very successful for us. We've changed our audience. Not so much the house tour audience, but the program audience. We've been doing salons and dialogue-based programs for 5 years now. We have a reputation for it. And you don't have to be a big place to have a reputation. We think of it as building civic engagement, and we talk to the politicians about it that way. And the corporations, they like that. We believe that these programs are having an impact and have changed the way people come together in Hartford. We can demonstrate, and then of course, impact is one of the trickiest measures we all do. If I was inspired to buy a historic site at the age of 9, they couldn't capture that impact at that time. And I talk about this to the funders any chance I get. However, we still need to be able to demonstrate our impact. So at the Stowe Center, we do it in a variety of ways, including gathering, so after the salon on Thursday about empathy, I had conversations with various people, and I wrote down later what they told me, and that goes on the list. So we're gathering the testimony at the time from folks. We do all kinds of other things too, but I'm not satisfied with it. But measuring impact is really important, you know it from the funders. And it's also another responsibility. Questions? Does anyone sort of sum up and make some observations about upcoming issues I want to make? So let's see. I want to wrap it up here because I'm at the end of my time. And then if John lets us go, we can do more questions. But I want you to, I've touched on a number of things as I talked. Public trust and engagement. I want you to think about how that plays out in your museums. I want you to think about the equity gap in the United States, how the equity gap is growing, headline news again, and what it means for all of us. So for example, in Mississippi, 35% of the children live under the poverty line. 35%. In 16 states, it's over 25% of the children. This is the United States of America, everybody. North Dakota is the lowest at 14%. That still seems high. The Pew Foundation says that during the first 2 years of the recovery, net worth of the top 7% of households went up 28%. And the 93% of the other households, all of us, went down 4%. What does that mean for the people we are working with in our audiences and as our partners and as our donors? What does it mean? You need to answer that. It threatens the American dream, it seems to me. Do you see an impact on state and local history? Just take them as facts. Whatever you think about, if it's right or wrong, take them as facts and decide what it means. We touched on civic disengagement. And I also tie that to the question of changes towards minority majority and what that means for our audiences, our staff, our donors, our support, our interest groups. And how would we act differently if we really took these things seriously? What would we do? The whole education world, this is another talk too, the whole education world from primary and secondary through college and universities is upside down. You can talk about STEM and whether or not history and the humanities are being included in primary and secondary schools and the issues that that means for our future audience. Nobody will come if they don't even know about history. And ASLH's work and the history branding program. Or you can talk about what will be the impact of the mass online courses, MOOCs, M-O-O-Cs. How many colleges and universities are going to disappear because the whole education, higher level education world is changing? And what does it mean for the credentials of our people, and what does it mean for our audiences? If you get your education in a mass online experience, how do you demonstrate your credentials, and how do we evaluate them? More and more people are going to be doing that. And it's a way to overcome inequities in education. And I also think globalization is a big issue. And I'm an anthropologist, so I know that globalization has been happening since those people at Scarborough were getting their copper bells from who knows where. Globalization is not new. But for us it means that people who come to our sites have been to London, Tokyo, and Phnom Penh, right? It means that the standards of customer service, and I don't mean facilities, but the standards of customer service and experience are, I hate this term, world class. They need to be at a level that people have experienced elsewhere and that they expect because of their travel. It also means that we shouldn't be looking at our historic context in just our town or county level. It's way beyond that. People want to know how it all fits together. People's interests are more complicated than they used to be. And as leaders in museums, whether you're an executive director or a senior leader, or you're at a more staff line, you're responsible for driving this thinking. And as leaders, you can have influence over the people who have influence over you. So if you're reporting to a board or you have a bunch of stakeholders you're dealing with, this is where you drive the change. If you're a staff line person, you can get to work on your supervisors and your executive director and get them thinking about it. Wouldn't recommend being too confrontational about it, but and remember that the executive director, as you all know, so I've been here not even 24 hours yet, and the most used phrase has been, it's all about the leadership. We talk about various issues at various organizations. It's all about the leadership. We can see it in Washington. It's all about the leadership. Remember that the executive director in your organization sets the tone, the leadership, and the culture in your organization. If you're the ED, keep that in mind and listen to your colleagues and your board. If you're not the ED, figure out how to mentor your ED so the culture moves appropriately. Don't be passive about it. Stand up, take charge, face the barriers, get to work on it. Thank you very much.